Good afternoon and welcome to the Debut Spotlight. I am your host today, Ellen Comisar, and I am thrilled to introduce Blaze Nation to Daria Lavelle, whose first novel is a beauty called Aftertaste. So before we get into our conversation about this lovely book, let me just do a little bit of housekeeping. For those of you who are longtime members of Blaze Nation, welcome back. We're always happy to see you. For those of you who are new to the Blaze, welcome for the first time. This, I hope, will not be the last. We are an organization of about 30 professional creatives who came together at the outset of COVID to make sure that authors connected with readers and with bookstores and vice versa. And we've now been going strong for 5 years, which is amazing. We have no intention of stopping. We hope COVID goes away entirely, but we're here to stay, so you're stuck with us. And we are all over social media. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter, which we refuse to call X. And so please look for us there, follow us, like us, retweet us, all that good stuff. And we have a website which offers you the opportunity to sign up for a newsletter, which will provide you all of the information for the shows that are upcoming on our schedule, as well as information about podcasts, etc. You can get that at amightyblaze.com. So that's the pitch. And now let me introduce you to Daria Lavelle. Daria's book has burst out on the scene, and I'm so excited to tell you about it. Radio Times put it on its top 20 lists of the best books of 2025 so far, saying it is simply one of those books that everyone's going to be talking about. The British Fantasy Society called it an exceptional and unique journey into the world of gourmet cuisine, and continued with its review saying it's a stunning debut, a magical, never read before experience from start to finish. Apple Books said it's a book to savor, one bite at a time. Elle proclaimed that Lavelle's skillful writing ultimately makes Aftertaste an evocative and, yes, mouth-watering read. It's an extraordinary book for foodies, for lovers, and for those who like a side of the supernatural, says Booklist. Lots of good food puns in all of these reviews. I'm going to skip ahead. It was also a most anticipated book from Goodreads, Barnes & Noble, LitHub, among others. Nigella Lawson, total foodie, called it a haunting evocation of pain and pleasure and the power of food. And if that's not enough to entice you, this novel has been acquired preemptively by Sony Pictures, and we'll talk about that as well. So congratulations on this achievement.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here. I'm so thrilled to get to talk to you about Aftertaste, and so honored for all of these nice words people have said about the book so far.
Well, I had to cut back because there were many more. Just let me introduce you, and then we can dive into our conversation. Daria Lavelle is an American fiction writer. She was born in Kyiv, Ukraine, and raised in the New York metropolitan area. Her work explores themes of identity and belonging through magic and the uncanny. Her short stories have appeared in The Deadlands, Dread Machine, and elsewhere. She has degrees in writing from Princeton and Sarah Lawrence College. I should know that one well. back of my neighborhood. She lives in New Jersey with her husband, children, and golden doodle, all of whom love a great meal almost as much as she does, and almost as much as her characters do. You can learn more at darialavelle.com. So welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to chat with you.
So one of the things I loved about this beautiful book,
and I'll hold up my version. This is the UK version.
We can talk a little bit about the differences because they are quite different. Is that it's a genre bender. Mm-hmm. It does not fall into one category or another, and it works. It's this great blending of a novel and a mystery and some ghosts and the supernatural and grief and memory. So did you set out to write it that way? What sort of inspired you to mix all of those different things into this one novel?
I love this question. So I'm a person who, in my nature, in the world, the way I move through the world, I love mashups. I love things that don't seem like they should go together. And then when you put them together, they make this sort of like alchemy, this magic. So I love that in music. I love it in food. Anytime there's some sort of fusion in cuisines and you're bringing two different things together and they just sing, it kind of sparks something in me. And especially in writing, I'm typically a speculative writer. I love there always to be a magical element. And I'm actually not typically a horror writer, but I knew when I first had this idea that ghosts felt so natural to me as a pairing with food. And the further that I got into it, the more I very consciously decided that I wanted to combine these things and subvert expectations about what these narratives are like. So I wanted to write a story about ghosts that wasn't scary. It wasn't a haunted house kind of story, no jump scares, no big kind of horror surprises. I wanted to write a story about food where the narrative isn't the typical, somebody wants to open a restaurant, they work really hard, they open the restaurant at the end. So I wanted to write something a little different. I wanted to have a love story that was sweeping and epic in scope, because that's the kind of love story that I love to consume. But I also didn't want it to follow the typical kind of beats of a typical love story plot. So I very consciously went into combining all of these things in ways that subverted all of those genres and tropes.
You have a line in the book. You have two lines that sort of refer to writing and fiction. One of which was, it's a plot line that only a novelist could devise, which is true, because we're out there imagining things and people are like, how did you get that? And the other line is where Kostya, your main character, says, ghost stories had nothing in common with actual ghosts. The writers wouldn't make every ghost into a haunt, some creepy ghoulie come back from the dead to wreak havoc and incite fear.
Mm-hmm.
And so in this case, we have some very friendly ghosts, no Casper showing up, but it's really interesting. So I was curious, like, were there real life literary influences? I was thinking as I read, like V.E. Schwab, The Incredible Life of Addie LaRue,
mm-hmm.
As well as some chefs who make, sort of came into my brain like 2 pages ahead of when you referenced them. So were you reading a lot of that? Are those the kind of books you typically read?
Yeah, I love V. Schwab's work. I think that her scope is just beautiful. Everything she writes is so different. I'm really excited for her new book that's coming out in a few weeks, actually. But I also really love the work of Kelly Link, of Karen Russell, of these writers who are kind of categorized as speculative fiction writers, but also fabulists, where they take every day, like it's our typical life that you're familiar with and you can recognize, but they put an element of a fable or a fairy tale into it, and there's this magic that comes from the combination of those things. So I love reading their work, and they were a huge influence on my work generally, but Aftertaste in particular, and thinking about how the rules of the world intersect with the rules of our everyday life, and how those things appear to one another. And then from a chef perspective and a cooking perspective, I think I had so many different influences. So I love the work of the late Anthony Bourdain. It spoke to me from the very first thing I read, and I've read basically his whole oeuvre, including some of his fiction, which a lot of people don't even know that he writes fiction.
Didn't know.
He actually has this very cool book that I think he collaborated with someone and edited it. And it's kind of this comic book about hungry ghosts and sort of like some of the Buddhist traditions and some folklore and mythologies from other places in the world. And it kind of centers around this tasting menu. It's very interesting. So I would recommend checking that out. But I think what I love about his work is that it's so accessible, and it's so clear that to him, food was never just food. It was so much more. It was a way to connect. It was a way to cross boundaries and bridges between people and cultures. And I think that was something that was really important to the writing of Aftertaste. And similarly, I love reading just sort of restaurant reviews. That's something that I enjoy and I take so much pleasure in. I even love reading restaurant menus, cookbooks, cover to cover. So I love to consume food and its preparation and its ingredients in so many different ways. I particularly love, the seminal Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat by Simon Nosrat. And it's just such a beautiful exploration of what those ingredients are and how to sort of cook intuitively using those components. And I think a lot of that is what I took onto the page as I was crafting these recipes that resurrect a spirit. Sort of the mechanism in Aftertaste If you're not familiar with it, it's a story about a chef whose food can bring a spirit back for a last meal with somebody that they loved. And a lot of where that magic and that alchemy happens is between the meal that is shared between the living and the dead. It's this representation of not just a meal they shared, but also a memory and the connection between them. And every single recipe that evokes that kind of transcendent connection and brings a spirit back in the story is very specifically and intentionally crafted, where the layers of flavor and the ingredients of every single part of that particular dish evoke certain emotions or memories. So for instance, there's a Reese's cup that recurs again and again and again in the story until we discover, which spirit is trying to channel which living person in our narrative, and how Constantine is going to connect them. And the Reese's cup is so much more than a Reese's cup. It is a memory of being abandoned and being kind of left at this moment when you needed someone so badly. And all of that goes to live in this little piece of chocolate.
I really felt, not that I'm haunted by my mother or other people who were great cooks in my past, but that's the reason we make the same recipes for holidays. And this was the special cranberry relish we always had at Thanksgiving. And just last week I made something, and my mother made it all the time and everybody loved it. And when I make it, or when I'm asked to make it, which is even more interesting, asked to make it by people who are in the family, my husband married in, and he's like, "Oh, why don't you make your mother's noodle pudding?" It's like, and it's just, it evokes a positive memory. As for these characters who are still grief stricken from the loss of their loved one, and still, as is Constantine, wanting to reconnect and struggling with memory. And so but instead of it being that he's cooking only for himself, he's tasting. He has this sensation in his mouth of sometimes just a specific food, and related to his own father, but also of somebody he's riding on the subway, and he just looks at somebody and he can sense. And so that whole idea of him being just aware of the food connections of others, I found really fascinating.
Yeah, it was really fun to write. And actually, the very first kind of kernel of this whole idea of this whole book. So I'm a writer who writes in images. I'll get an idea in my head, and it's almost like a scene that I can see play out like a movie. And the very first kind of seed, the kernel of this whole thing, was the scene of this chef in this Hell's Kitchen apartment. It's this really kind of falling apart apartment. It's not great. And he's in this kitchen that's not a great kitchen, and he's plating this dish of food, and he's being so particular and meticulous. And then he sets it on the table, and this beautiful glittering spirit comes through the crumbling brick wall to try and eat it. And I had all of these questions about it, like, who is this guy? Who is the spirit? What's the deal with the food? What's the connection here? Can he do this just for her? Is this something he can replicate for any spirit? Can he do this for other people? And it took me a very long time to figure out the answers to those questions and build this bigger story out of this one scene. But the thing that kind of jump-started a lot of it, I was doing some research unrelated to this book, just like trolling on the internet as one does. And I went on Wikipedia as one does. And I came across this article that made me click. It was about the psychic senses. And I started with clairvoyance. And then I clicked into this one article that's not even there anymore because it was, one page, uncited. Who knows who wrote it? But it had this little synopsis of how clairvoyance comes from the combination of clair and voyer, which in French is to see. So it's to see from the other side. But every one of the five senses has an associated psychic clair. So some people can feel from the other side, some people can hear from the other side, and some people can taste from the other side. And that's called clairgustance. And as soon as I saw that, I was like, wait, that's what that guy had in my scene, in my little vision of this chef. That's what it is. He can taste from the other side. He can experience these flavors. And like you mentioned, it starts with him. He loses his father when he's young. And then very shortly after that, in his grief, he begins to experience the flavors of his dad's favorite dish. And then he gets to have these other flavors come to him of foods he's never eaten, cuisines he's never tried. And he knows they're not his dad, but he knows they're also coming from the other side. And those are the sort of aftertaste that the book is named after.
If you're just joining us, we're talking to Daria Lavelle, author of the debut Aftertaste, which came out this week in the US and in the UK.
Yeah, it was the 20th. Your cover is the US cover. That's came out on May 20th, and this is the UK cover. It actually comes out today, the 22nd.
How wonderful is that? This is a debut novel. You can find that scene of curiosity and cooking and many more things in this book, which then expands and gives our character Kostya the opportunity to cook and make drinks in some really wonderful places and meet some very interesting ghosts. So I wanted to ask you, we have a lot of interesting characters in the book, some of which are ghosts, some of which are real life people, or real life people in fiction.
in our reality.
Our reality of reading the book. Which were the characters that were like most fun to write, and which were the ones that are now sort of hard for you to let go of, in keeping with the theme of letting go of people?
Yeah. Well, I love all my children equally. But if I had to pick one, I would say the one that was the most just like fun and vibrant to write, and I think this comes across in the reading experience, is Frankie. He just leapt off the page at me. So Frankie is Constantine's best friend. He is a chef in New York City. He's this rising star, and he is the guy who is the life of every party. Everyone loves him. He's quick with a joke. He's good looking. He's very charming. And one of the functions that he serves in the story not only is Constantine's best friend and roommate, but he also kind of shepherds him into the culinary world. Once he hears about these aftertastes he's been experiencing, he says, wait a minute, you have to pursue this. And he encourages him to kind of explore his culinary talents and figure out what these flavors really mean. And he also serves as kind of a tour guide throughout the story. And that becomes a really interesting, energetic set of scenes. And they're actually written in first person POV from Frankie. So to be able to write in his voice was so exciting and so energetic, and to put myself into the head of a character who is frankly far cooler than I will ever hope to be was really, really fun.
I really thought you were going to say Victor, who becomes Kostya's sponsor.
Benefactor. Yeah, he's the investor of the restaurant.
He's a Russian immigrant who speaks, and the dialogue is really wonderful, and speaks in a semi-broken English, which is fine. You know, we got to recognize that if you're speaking a second language in a new country, you're well ahead of most of us in terms of your intellect. But you capture this guy who's really slick, who's really got more money than he knows what to do with. And we really don't know for a while if he's a good guy or a bad guy, but we know that he sets up Kostya in a restaurant of his own, which then adds a twist to the whole meeting up of ghosts and what they want to do, because it's Kostya's goal, once he figures out he can do this, to do it more often, and that he will be somehow helping others the way he wishes he himself could be helped. So clearly you're a real foodie, and I'm curious, has that always been the case? Were you a foodie as a kid?
Yeah.
Are you a cook? Do you like
all of the above. So my family is Ukrainian. We emigrated from Ukraine to the US when I was 2. And so food was always this really central thing in my family. We had meals together, we cooked together, and we always had sort of Eastern European and Ukrainian food. And that was one of the biggest ties to our homeland and our ancestry and our heritage. And that was one of the primary ways that I had access to that from the US, especially being so little and not being able to remember a lot of my life in Ukraine. Like, I couldn't remember the apartment that we lived in or the street we lived on, but I could remember the food, and I could remember, all sorts of flavors that would bring me back home. And growing up, I was obsessed with cooking. My family is full of really gourmet cooks, home cooks. And my parents were also really adventurous. So they would buy a cookbook for a random cuisine and go and source the ingredients. And this was at a time before the internet was what it is, and you could just order something. Like, they would go and they would find these obscure ingredients, and they would make French cuisine and Spanish cuisine and Japanese food. And my dad would still to this day hand roll sushi, which I find really incredible. And so we were always trying new flavors and being really excited about food. And we were always watching the Food Network as a family. And it was constantly on in our house. Like I grew up listening to Nigella Lawson. So the fact that she read and blurbed this book was just really mind blowing for me.
Exciting.
And then as I got older, food always became a way for me to connect with my friends and my family, and going out to eat and experiencing what it was like, not only to have the food that was prepared, but also what the service was like, what the experience of a restaurant was like. That was really special. And I'm always one of these eaters that kind of like peeks around and tries to sneak into the kitchen and see what's going on. And my older cousin actually is a New York City chef. So
Wow.
I was able to, in the various jobs that he's had, get to see inside a professional kitchen and kind of learn from him what that experience is like. So it's always been a major part of my life, and it's always been my way of exploring New York City, especially in my 20s. There's a whole array of restaurants that inspired the restaurants in Aftertaste. And especially, I was writing this when COVID-19 happened and everything kind of shut down. And it was my way in my fantasies of going back to those places that I was dying to eat at but couldn't go to in person.
This is definitely a New York novel, though not in a way. I lived in New York, but it's not in a way that's going to push people who don't know New York away. It's got that energy and excitement, but it also has the immigrant experience, which in New York is, such a presence. So we have this protagonist who literally is starting out as the dishwasher and then ending up as the head chef at what is expected to be a very fancy restaurant that is getting a lot of buzz before it's even opening. And so I wonder how that, like, was that intentional to sort of tell that American dream story, or did it just sort of evolve as Kostya needed to evolve so he could bring more ghosts into his world?
Yeah, I think it was a little bit of both. I think I certainly put a lot of my own kind of childhood experiences around food and what it was like to grow up as an immigrant, especially framed by the experience of food, into him. So obviously food was this really important connection to me, to my homeland, but it was also in a lot of ways this source of not feeling American enough and not feeling assimilated enough. And there's no clearer giveaway than if you're in a middle school cafeteria and everyone around you is eating something that's not what you're eating, and everyone looks at your lunchbox like, ew, what is that? And so Kostya has that experience. He's got a foot in two worlds growing up. He's got a foot in the US and he's got a foot in Ukraine, and he doesn't know where he belongs. And then the one person, his dad, who might have bridged that gap for him, is gone. And then as he grows up and he develops these aftertastes and begins to work with them, he's got a foot in two worlds, and that happens to be the world of the living and the world of the dead. And so he never manages to sort of figure out where he is and where he's going until he embraces that. And so I wanted to give him that trajectory of almost like a hero's journey of finding his way to becoming a hero of his own story through the kitchen and through the traditional narrative. But at the same time, as he's finding all of this success in the culinary world, as he's rising through the ranks, and with the abilities that he has and all the foods he's tasted, he's really good at putting together ingredients, understanding, how things work together or don't in terms of flavors. As all of that is happening in the forefront, in the background, what he's doing is causing some serious problems in the afterlife. So there's a reckoning to come for this hero's journey that he finally decides to take.
Right. So the other thing that it touches on, and you've spoken to it a little bit here, is sort of how childhood trauma, in this case, Kostya's having left his country and then losing his father, how that trauma affects him as an adult. And what's interesting is that there's a lot of focus on memories and grief and people who have not gotten over either their personal trauma or the passing of someone they loved. But there's also a lot of humor. There's many times where I was just cackling. I do.
Thank you.
So was that a challenge to write, or was that something also that you felt a need to add the levity to sort of lighten the book and not make it so heavy? I mean, even the ghosts are funny sometimes.
That was, well, first of all, thank you. I'm glad that came through. That was very, very, very intentional when I set out to write this book, and thinking about those tropes that I was talking about and kind of subverting those storylines. I knew when I set out to write a book that had to do with ghosts and death and the afterlife and grief, that I didn't want it to feel heavy. I didn't want it to feel, I don't want to say one note because that's a little bit reductive, but I didn't want it to only feel heavy. I wanted a reader to feel a really broad spectrum of emotions. Like when you're eating a delicious meal or a tasting menu, there's different adventures that you're going on. And I also think that that's more true to life. I think even if you're dealing with something really terrible and heavy, like grief and the loss of somebody, there are still moments in your life that can make you laugh and that can balance that a little bit. And I very, very intentionally thought about when and where I was putting heavier scenes, and I made sure to always sandwich them between lighter scenes or scenes with a different kind of energy. So if there's a scene where a spirit's coming back, I would always try to put around it a scene where there's a party, or a scene where there's, you know, a really high energy restaurant moment, to try to kind of balance it. And in fact, the whole structure of the book, this is like really insider stuff now, but
our viewers love the insider.
But the book is actually, it's structured in 5 parts. So there's a different kind of part, and they're broken up by different prefaces. And in every part, we have the main narrative for Kostya, for Konstantin, and that's told in kind of close third person, and it's his story, and it's in chronological order, and how he, you know, develops these aftertastes and what he does. And then in between all of those chapters are these very brief interstitial chapters that are told from a different character's point of view. So in some cases it's Frankie, like we talked about. In some cases it's other characters. And in my head, it was like, I structured it like a tiered wedding cake. So every part is like a tier, and every part has the cake part, and then it has the frosting part. And I was very intentional about, you know, whatever is happening in the cake part is balanced by the tone of what's happening in the frosting part. So if the cake is more sad or melancholy or reflective, the frosting is high energy and funny and bright, and vice versa. So as you read, that's something to kind of maybe pay attention to, how those scenes balance between light and darkness. It was very intentionally kind of structured that way.
That's a great metaphor for, and a way to think about our writing for those of us who are still out there developing our craft. So what was a pub day like for you on Tuesday, and how are you celebrating and taking in all of this buzz?
It's been absolutely magical. I can't even express how grateful I am. I have the most incredible team at Simon & Schuster. And we wound up doing a launch event the night before in New York City, which was so special. And I had so many friends and family and former classmates from all different walks of my life. And it was so just, I was overwhelmed with joy and support and gratitude to get to experience that with them. And then an actual pub day, we had a launch event at an indie bookstore in my hometown, or my sort of adult hometown in Hoboken, New Jersey, called Little City Books. So the New York City event was at McNally Jackson, and then we had Little City Books event, and they were both just absolute magic. I had so many people show up for me. That was just, it warmed my heart in so many ways, and the story has excited so many people. And there were even people there who I didn't know, who had either read an arc and really loved it, or, you know, followed me on Instagram and got into the story and came. And it meant so much to me to see this book connect with readers in that way.
Was there very good food served?
There were good cocktails served.
Okay.
So Little City actually made versions of the Spectral Sour, which is the very first cocktail, the very first dish of any sort that Konstantin actually tries to recreate from a spirit. So it's the first one that actually brings a ghost back. And it was so cool and so special to be able to drink that with friends and family, and to talk about what it meant. It's been, the food in this book has been this incredible journey. So we had this event a few months back now that Simon & Schuster put on in combination with an organization called Tables of Contents, which is out of Brooklyn, where they take authors who have published something that have to do with food, and they'll create meals around what those foods are. And we did a whole event that was just based on aftertaste and the food and aftertaste. And it was the wildest thing to get to taste some of these foods that I had completely invented and never actually experienced in real life, with the exception of, you know, what I imagined in my head they would taste like. So that's been a really magical experience too.
Our founder, Jenna Blum, has a book out called The Lost Family, where the character is a chef
Oh,
and
amazing.
so she went into great details creating these menus and recipes, which if you were fortunate enough to go to one of those events where she had time beforehand, she actually made one of the
Oh,
events. There was I forget what it was. It was a chocolate cherry tort of some sort,
ooh, I
if
love
I'm
that.
not mistaken. So the food was just, the book was infused with it. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions and we're going to open it up to questions. So viewers, don't be shy. If you have questions about anything related to Aftertaste for our wonderful author, Daria Lavelle, I'm sorry, please put them in the chat and we will get to them shortly. So what are you working on next? Anything in the in the hopper?
Yeah, I'm working on another novel. It's still very early, so who knows if this will be the next thing that I actually publish, but it's also speculative fiction. It's also a sweeping kind of epic love story, but this one is more kind of a combination, going back to that idea of mashups. It's a combination of historical fiction, mythology, and fairy tale. It's about a woman who falls in love with a sailor on an enchanted ship.
Oh, wow. That does sound good. And are you already working with your agent on it, or has it been?
I'm in the drafting process now, so it's still very, very early, but it's a story much like Aftertaste. I tend to get a big idea and then let it percolate for a long time while I kind of accumulate enough detail of the world and enough clarity in my own mind about what it wants to be able to write it. So I'm in the process now where I've accumulated enough where I'm starting to actually put pen to paper, or in my case, like letters to keyboard.
So there's a bit of research and planning and versus just let's see where this takes me.
It's a little of both. So I write without outlines, which is like a whole other conversation. But
it's like cooking without a recipe.
And that's what I do too in the kitchen. So I go into it with this big idea. I go into it with some of the feelings and vibes I want. And it's helpful to me to have some idea of like what a future plot point might be, or like in the case of Aftertaste, I knew the ending before I started writing. I knew where it was going to go. I just didn't know any of the middle. So it's kind of figuring out how I get from A to Z and what all those letters in between are.
Sounds good. So I understand we have a few questions. So I'm going to ask Chuck to post them. If you still have questions, we still have time to get to them. So please don't hesitate. Our friend Mark says, can you explain your writing process?
Sure. So I alluded to it a little bit just now. I usually will get I call it a big idea. So it tends to be something where an image comes to me, like that image of the chef in the kitchen, for instance, and I feel like it's got something to it. And it's sort of intuitive. It sounds very like kind of hokey woo woo, but it's true. It's very intuitive to me. I always know. And I know that in my case, it's an idea that is going to obsess me enough where A, I have to write it out of my system or it will haunt me forever. And B, it's going to be meaty enough to sustain me for the course of writing a whole novel. Because sometimes an idea is really good, but it's only enough for a short story, for example, or or a novella at its longest length. But for a whole full-length novel, it has to have more scope and more to explore, and I think more thematically also. And so I start with these big ideas, and then I start to build the world around them. So in this case, I didn't know who the chef was in that vision. I didn't know who the ghost was. I didn't know what the mechanism was. And I started writing it originally as just one scene. And it wound up being a scene that exists somewhere towards like the first third, towards the middle of the book, where Constantine opens this little supper club in his apartment.
Right.
And the very first thing I wrote that basically has stayed there was the advertisement for that supper club. So that's in the final version of the book. But I knew the story was bigger than that. It wasn't just, a scene of a supper club and the people who came to eat there. It was bigger. It had to do with the whole culinary world. It had to do with New York City. It had to do with a bigger journey. And so I started to acquire, over a long period of time, these breadcrumbs of ideas. So there was that Wikipedia article with this breadcrumb of Clairgustons. There was a bar that I went to with my husband, and I looked up and I saw it was called the Library of Distilled Spirits. And I said, wait a minute, we can't speak for the next 20 minutes. I have to furiously write something down now. And I took notes, and that became a scene in the book. So I think part of my process is having this idea, initially the seed, and then opening myself to what are all the tendrils and the possible ways the seed can sprout and grow. And as I write the first draft, I kind of follow my characters. So any twists that exist in the story truly like are not plotted and planned. It's me following an instinct of what a character says or does. And a lot of times, especially in that first draft process, they surprise me. Like some of the twists and turns I think are surprising to readers because they were surprising to me. I was like, wait, that just happened? That's crazy. That can't happen. Actually, no, that should happen. So it's part of what I do is to say yes to where my characters want to take me. And then when I get to the end, then I go back and I reread. And once I have my arms around what this bigger story is, I'll refine, I'll make sure that the world building is clear, that the magic system is clear, the logic is clear, the progression of the characters are clear. But it starts with kind of coming up with an idea that feels big enough and then following it for me.
How long did it take from that big idea spark till you queried this to an agent? And then from that point till publication?
Yeah, so I had that first spark because I went back and I found the file that I wrote that little story in. That spark was in January of 2013.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, a long time ago. And then the breadcrumbs came over many years. I didn't start writing it in earnest as a novel until 2019, 2020, when I had just entered an MFA program, and we had a novel writing course, and they said, come with the idea you want to write. And I was thinking and thinking, and I said, this hasn't left me alone now. It's been over 6 years and I'm still thinking about it. Like, this is a big idea. And so I went back, and then I started to think about what the world is and how to build it out. So I wrote it for a couple of years. And then in 2023, I went on submission with it with my agent, and that's when the acquisition process happened.
And here we are. It's good to know. We always hear mixed reviews about whether it makes sense to go to an MFA program, and clearly in your case, it worked out well.
Yeah, I had a great experience. I met my agent through the MFA program, even though it was sort of just an unintentional meet and greet. It was supposed to be to practice our query letters and practice our pitch, and we just hit it off, and she loved the idea for Aftertaste, and here we are, happily ever after.
Here we are. Are there other questions? Did you actually make or create each dish as you wrote?
So some of the dishes.
Great question from, is it Miriam Leah Burtock, I believe. Burlock.
I made some of them. So some of them were dishes that were things that my family just makes constantly over and over again. So for instance, there's a scene in the book where Kostya he's first starting to date his love interest, Mora, and he wants to make her a really special meal that kind of is a way of expressing how he feels and who he is and what his history is. And he's a person who's not great with words, but he's really good with food. And that's how he communicates all of his emotions and his feelings and his desires and what he wants to say. And so he makes her, actually he teaches her to make, they make them together, pilmeni, these little dumplings, and also vareniki, which are a different kind of dumpling. And those are things that I grew up eating. And so those were certainly foods that I made and enjoyed throughout the writing of this book. And there were others. For instance, there's a buffalo chicken soup that exists in the book that I have not tasted anything resembling that in my life until that dinner that we had where a chef recreated it. But it was based on flavors that I intuitively, as a cook and as an eater, knew would go well together. So that's a potato-based soup with blue cheese crumbles, and it's got a floater of a buffalo chicken wing on it, and it's got layers of Guinness and celery and some other ingredients. So in my mind, when I put it together, I said, this is like the soup version of, buffalo wings when you're at the bar, but in a way that feels a little bit softer and has more meaning for the characters that are experiencing it together.
That sounds great. I would eat that.
It was really good.
Other questions? Would you consider a recipe booklet for book clubs?
Yeah, absolutely. There's actually on my site, if you go to darialavelle.com, there's a few assets up there now for book clubs, and there's a spectral sour recipe, so you can make the cocktail that starts it all off. And I would love to
converse.
That's right. And I would love to to kind of find more ways to bring the foods of this book into readers' lives. That's a great idea.
Okay, well, I have a couple questions. We still have time. If there are people who want to ask, please put them in our chat. We are, of course, talking to Daria Lavelle, author of Aftertaste. So two questions from me, and we'll see if there are some more from our viewers. One, without giving away your favorite New York restaurant, what's a great unknown New York restaurant or cuisine that New Yorkers and tourists should know about?
Oh, that's such a good question. So I will say this. I will say it's very well known to New Yorkers, but I think tourists kind of balk at it. So New Yorkers love their corner coffee truck. There's basically every corner in Manhattan. If you walk outside on a morning, there's a coffee cart that sells bagels and coffee and all sorts of little like pastries and things like that. And if you want the experience of what it's like to be a New Yorker running to work and getting that and picking it up and eating and drinking it and getting the little blue cup, that is something to check out because that's just an authentic New York experience, much like street meat, which always kind of smells better than it tastes sometimes. But I think those are kind of authentic hidden gems that New Yorkers know about, but that kind of tourists and people new to New York don't really think about. And then I would say a cuisine that I think is interesting that's, very near and dear to me that I think a lot of people don't know how to access is Eastern European cuisine and Ukrainian cuisine. And there's an awesome restaurant, very famous, called Veselka, which is in the East Village. And if you go there, they have incredible vareniki. You can taste the kinds of things that Konstantin cooks and grows up eating. And there's a really amazing food culture just around Ukrainian food and Eastern European food. There's a lot of pickles, a lot of so much fish, so much salted fish and smoked fish and every variety of fish, caviar and these really thin crepes. And there's so much to explore there. So I would say that's something to check out.
Thank you. We have one more question, I understand. Who is the easiest or hardest character to flesh out and breathe life into?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think the easiest is a toss-up between Frankie because he came to me so fully formed. There was like I could picture him so clearly and I kind of knew who he was. It's a toss-up between him and Konstantin. I think once I figured out that Konstantin was my way to channel my experience as an immigrant, my experience as a Ukrainian, my experience kind of going through COVID and the war in Ukraine while I wrote this book and feeling the grief and all of the things that I felt and putting that into him. Once I figured out that he was my, not stand-in because he's very different from me as a person, but he was my way to express some of the things that I have the hardest time expressing in life. Once I figured that out, he was really easy to channel into. I think that Maura was difficult, not because she's difficult, but because she's a character who keeps a lot of secrets in the book. And it's sort of like when you're writing a whodunit and you know whodunit and you're trying not to reveal as you write. So I actually didn't know the secrets she was keeping until I got to that part of the book and wrote them. But as I went back in revision, I had to make sure that every scene with her before that big reveal, which happens, in the last third of the book, I had to make sure every scene had her saying things that reflected what she knew, but that also addressed the character she was talking to who didn't know and was assuming something different. And so if you go back and reread and you look at her dialogue and what she says, you're like, oh, wait, that has a second meaning. That's not just this. It's because XYZ.
Great. All right. So before we wrap up, I just have to ask you, you got to deal with Sony Pictures, which is highly unusual for a book that has yet to come out and that is a debut. So first of all, congratulations on that.
Thank you.
Who's your dream cast? Can you picture them?
Yeah, I mean, so it was such a dream to have that first conversation with them years ago now. I've been keeping secrets. I've been sitting on that secret for a while. But I loved how excited they were. And in my head, I had already, of course, fan cast this. So I feel like Kostya needs to be either a complete unknown or somebody who can like really morph into a character. And I feel like Miles Teller could be an amazing choice because I feel like he embodies characters so deeply. So he's the one that I had kind of in my head as I was thinking about what is Kostya like? What could he be like? Could he be this kind of like surly person who doesn't trust, but then really opens up to Mora's character? Mora was always Anya Taylor-Joy in my mind. I just think she has that kind of, like, she's an incredible actress, first of all, and I think she could keep all of the secrets with a straight face, but then really reveal it to the audience. But I also feel like she's able to embody these characters that have this kind of haunted nature to them, which I love and which is very true to Mora. She's haunted by a loss that she's experienced in her life. For Frankie, Mason Gooding would be an amazing choice. He's just so charismatic and he like leaps off the screen when you look at him and you listen to him. So I think he could be a really fun choice.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We are finishing up a great conversation with Daria Lavelle, whose book Aftertaste came out Tuesday in the US and came out today, May 22nd in the UK, and is got a lot of buzz and all deserved. So we wish you great luck with this as you go forward.
Thank you.
And I will be back on June 19th at our usual time, which is 2 p.m. Eastern, when my guest will be debut novelist Evanthea Bromley. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who's written a great novel, very different from this one, called Crown. So we'll see you then. Until then, keep reading.